Well, we can say that regulating artificial intelligence is a very complex challenge due to the very large amount of sectors and actors involved. Although Europe has lost ground in the race to regulate artificial intelligence because of lack of investment and also delay in taking the decision to regulate together, now it stands out instead for this decision to have a horizontal legislation for this complex technology. It's striking that China has in the last year partly caught up in the race to regulate after having allowed its companies a great deal of freedom precisely to make them emerge in the global market. In fact, China has recently had privacy and cybersecurity legislation in place and is now also regulating the use of algorithms. The United States, on the other hand, is apparently more reluctant to regulate artificial intelligence, seeing in Europe's choices the intention to penalize American companies. This is a kind of debate we often hear. Regardless of the strategic evaluations that each country is entitled to make in this area, such we can say such a situation with different speeds will not help the development of common standards. And so far we have only mentioned the big players such as China and the United States, but we must not forget other situations like India, Middle East, and the African continent. As we have seen in recent years, the development of artificial intelligence must also take into account ethical and cultural aspects. We have seen this in the first instance with the biases present in facial recognition, which is very efficient with images of white men and with many errors in images with Black women. It's important to look for a common way to develop systems that take into account the diversity of human society. So to this end, the European Union can certainly lead the way, as it is perhaps the institution that best takes into account cultures of so many different countries that do not speak the same language. But the contribution of international organizations such as the OECD, which are already at work, will also be extremely useful. Being able to count on shared standards, both regulatory and technical, will enable businesses to prosper and citizens around the world to have even greater guarantees that their fundamental rights will be protected without being overly influenced by their geographical location. This is also a power struggle. So we still have to see where it will go, but I think that we can contribute on these developments with this work on the AI Act.
Thanks, Brando. So if Europe was to take an entirely different approach to China and North America, if there was no alignment between those three big players, as it were, would that be damaging for Europe in your view?
Well, I think it will be a problem, not just for Europe, for all the players involved, because artificial intelligence will be very pervasive technology. I'm sure it will become the internet of the next years in terms of penetration in daily lives of people. So having two different contexts of application, standards, and regulation will make it complicated to deal with with all the activities that now interconnect the world. So I think we need really to put an effort in avoiding this situation.
Yeah. Now, with digital technologies such as artificial intelligence, we've had this sort of winner takes all dynamic, where often a big player accumulates sufficient scale that they're able to outcompete their competition. Does that, given that dynamic, there's a temptation towards some kind of national economic protectionism and kind of safeguarding your companies within your own regions, etc. What would you say to people who make those kind of arguments?
I think that especially if we look at the European context, in fact, the AI Act has been proposed because there was the tendency to already fragment the market about artificial intelligence. Some member states were starting to develop some own regulation on that. And so I don't think it's in the interest of the European Union to fragment its internal market on AI, and so that's why we are taking this lead. I don't see the advantage for a national adaptation, because we are already, to be honest, in another world confronted to when the European Union was only looking at the competition rules from a more competition perspective, while now we clearly have an idea of having some industrial policy and some economic policy to be more strategically directed from the European level also. Think of something that is in the backbone of what we are talking about, that is the chips. And so the Chips Act for the European Union, which is the example of an industrial policy for the EU. But this needs to be done at European level if we want to have the possibility to be competitive. And so I see the same for the AI regulation.
Yeah, okay. Now, Brenda, let's turn to the progress of the AI Act, and essentially whether you think it could become a template for other regions. Is the EU moving sufficiently quickly? First question. And secondly, do you see other other regions waiting to see what emerges from the EU process before they act? In other words, is the EU going to set some kind of template here?
Well, yesterday we had the first hearing of the IMCO committee. Yesterday, the hearing was extremely interesting and provided valuable insights from experts on some key areas of the regulation that still need reflection, such as the distribution of responsibilities across the AI value chain, the governance structure, and its possible models, the criteria defining high-risk AI. Since this is the first world attempt to regulate AI, such reflections are still needed and welcome, and we will feed into the work that we are currently conducting together with my co-rapporteur, Dragos Tudorake. Our aim is to ensure a clear and human-centric, future-proof legislation on AI, and I think we are going in the right direction. The two parliamentary committees in charge, IMCO and LIBE, will soon publish their report, which will be ambitious and will contain visions shared by the two committees. This will be starting point for proposing further amendments. The jury committee, on the other hand, has just presented its report, and the council is and will feed as an opinion on our work, and the council is proceeding in the same way and at the same pace as the parliamentary work. I hope that the final text will be ready by summer 2023, as final in terms of negotiated with the council, or at the latest by the end of next year.
Yeah. And is that, in your view, is that sufficient? Is that sufficiently quick?
We should be quicker, but the way the European Union functions, the way the negotiations happen, will make it difficult to be quicker than that. Also because the council is divided; they're still discussing. I think if I need to make a bet, I think that the Parliament will come earlier with its position.
And what would you say to companies, researchers, others who are working on AI today, and they may be kind of concerned that at some point in the future they could be blindsided or fall foul of the regulation? Should they just proceed and get on with it, or should they be waiting to see how this process plays forward?
Well, I think it's a complicated balance. I hope that there is enough space to see, in the next months, an alignment on the main issues between Parliament and Council, so that there can be already some prediction of a possible way forward, so that there is no not an effect of the depression on the capability to innovate and invest. This is a complicated issue, I understand, but we need to give, I think, a clear message as soon as possible on the main issues. For example, on the chain of responsibilities, which will be very important. I hope that we can find agreement on such a topic, or on the certification issue in time, so that we can have some degree of legal certainty even before the final approval.
Yeah, and these definitions of the risk categories, and I think there's questions around how fluid that might be, and whether certain applications might move ultimately between risk categories. That's something that people could be concerned about. How concrete do you think they will be?
Yeah, this is a topic we still have to decide if to change the list. There will be a discussion going on between the political groups in the European Parliament, and also with the Council. So we will see what will happen on this. To be honest, I cannot say much more at the moment. For sure, one thing that we will try to strengthen in the list is the protection of democracy and democratic processes, that is a bit weak in the existing list. But I don't exclude that also the list will be modified by removing some specific categories.
Right. Yeah, I want to leave time for a couple of audience or speaker questions if there are any, but I just want to touch on enforcement as well, because I think one of the questions around the digital economy, of course, is enforcement, particularly when you've got players outside of Europe, you've got the big global tech players, etc. How easy will it be to enforce this regulation? Seeing Brando's image has disappeared, actually. I wonder if he's got a connection problem there. Brando, are you able to hear me?
Yes, sorry, I had a connection issue.
Yeah, no problem. Well, I don't know if you heard the question, but it was basically around...
Oh, can you please repeat it? Yes, sorry.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no. So a question around enforcement, and essentially how enforceable this act will be, both within Europe and outside Europe, particularly with the big global tech players, etc. Will we be reliant on internal whistleblowers, for example, to help with enforcement?
Well, the enforcement is probably one of the most complex points, because in the end, without that, it will be useless to have this regulation. Also, it needs to take into account the interdisciplinary nature of the sectors affected by AI. Some call for the creation of a European agency for artificial intelligence, others for only coordination currently envisaged in the text. At the national level, some would like the data protection authorities to head the authority at European level, as they have the most experience in the data sector, while others propose ad hoc authorities, perhaps interdisciplinary with members of different sectoral authorities. A lot of investment in human and economic resources will certainly be needed. This is for sure, whatever is the solution we take, given the amount of work on the horizon and the risks to be prevented for fundamental rights. The current approach is different from that of the GDPR, but the risks of bottlenecks or very different decisions from one authority to another must be avoided. We are working on this. In addition, there will be a separate legislative proposal from the Commission on AI liability. When AI comes to the courts, we will have to have judges who are able to understand very complex analysis and documents. So proper training will be needed to avoid that courts decide differently from one country to another because of lack of legal training. It will be desirable as well to have a minimum of coordination with other international authorities. In general, to conclude on as an answer to this question, we need to have a set of redress instruments so that people can trust the fact that they can have a satisfaction for any violation of their rights based on the usage of AI. We need to build this trust by showing that the regulation can actually work. I think this is crucial. Otherwise, all this debate on trust will just not have substance.
Yeah. And a final question, just before we take some from the audience. I think I understand you're in favor of some kind of regulatory sandboxes to maybe help with scientific research or innovation, etc. Can you give us a view on how that would work in the context of the AI Act? Would people have to apply for a kind of regulatory sandbox of some kind? What are you thinking about there?
Well, the issue of the sandboxes, I think, is very important when we look at the idea of having an important degree, a significant degree of regulation. We are talking about a big amount of rules to be respected, especially for the high risk, obviously. And so it's very important. It's very important to have, on the other hand, spaces where you can build experimentation and development of new business models. So sandboxes, properly regulated, I think are very important.
Okay, no, thanks, Brando. Right, so we're a bit short of time. We've got a quick question from one of the speakers here, from Everett Stamhouse. Now he's asking, would you imagine or like the category of banned applications of AI to be extended? So would you extend that list of banned applications that's in the draft legislation?
Well, on the banned applications, I think that both the Parliament and the Council will easily agree on extending the social scoring banning also for the private entities. And the other issue where we might need to work on, this is my will need to be discussed at Parliament level, is to restrict more the exceptions to the banning of the mass surveillance through facial recognition. Because today this is a banned use, but with exceptions that might need to be restricted further.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you, Brando, for running through those topics so quickly. I know we're covering a lot of ground very fast, but I appreciate you taking the time to join us today. And apologies for the technical issues. We have slightly overrun in terms of time, but hopefully you can get to your next appointment. Thanks again for joining us, Brando.
Thank you very much. I hope it was interesting and communicative on the main issues we are confronted with. And thanks for the invitation. Thank you very much. You
set the scene well for the coming panel discussion. So thank you, Brando. So we'll now turn to our first segment. And we have three lead speakers in this segment. We have Alex Engler. He's a fellow of governance studies at Brookings. We have Vidushi Mada, Senior Program Officer with Article 19. Vidushi's based in India. And Juha Heckler, he's head of the Robotics and Artificial Intelligence Unit at DG Connect in the European Commission. So thank you to the three of those for joining us. This segment is going to focus on the case, the big picture, why we need international harmonization, both within Europe and globally, and whether that is actually achievable. I'm going to ask each of the speakers to make 4 to 5 minutes of opening remarks, then we'll get into a panel discussion, and then we will be able to take some questions from the audience, which you can enter via the chat. You can put those in at any time, but we'll take them towards the end of this discussion. So we'll begin with Alex. We'll get some opening remarks from him, then Vidushi, and then to Juha. So Alex, I'll give the floor to you.
Sure. Thanks, David. Glad to be here. Glad to have this important conversation. Such a timely day. So well done. And thank you to you all at Science Business. So a couple of comments. I want to talk first about the EU AI Act and the potential for a Brussels effect. What that has to do with some the developments going on in the United States. Why that helps us make this international alignment being an important argument, and just a couple closing thoughts on how we might start to do that. And I will try to do that in 5 minutes. So talking about the EU AI Act, the first thing to note is that it's just not obvious or universal that there'll be a Brussels effect that hits every type of algorithmic system. It's not true. Pretty nuanced, in the weeds by application. You're going to have some effects that are pretty broad. Some may not change things that much. Here are a few examples. If you're a financial services website and you have a chatbot, if you have EU customers, you'll need to disclose that that chatbot is an AI system. And most companies will probably do this whether they have a lot of EU citizens or using their service or not. It's just not worth making 2 websites, right? Kind of the same GDPR situation. It's not worth having 2 of these systems, so just follow the regulation. But that's not always going to be true. Look at a multinational company that operates inside and outside the EU. that uses an algorithmic hiring software. You can just think McDonald's, for instance, and they are using this in their hiring process. Well, that's going to be high risk. McDonald's is going to be the user here. They're going to have those risk management, high quality data sets, technical documentation requirements. And so are they going to certainly do this in the entire world? Maybe, maybe not, right? They may choose just to do it in their European setting rather than in every hiring process around the world. I don't think that's obvious. The algorithmic provider itself, the developer, which in this case would be the provider, may also choose to follow just some of these requirements that you and not elsewhere. Might save them time and money. And again, they're not required to. It's not like a website. It's easier for them to have two versions of the system. A slightly different take on that, if you're LinkedIn, however, which would qualify in the same way, high risk as an employment service, yeah, all of a sudden, maybe you're going to have to follow this internationally. So there's a difference between platforms and AI-driven software, and the effect that has a Brussels effect depends on that. Just one note reflecting what MEP Benify was just saying, the social credit scoring is another example that probably will hit quite a few platforms, or at least services that are doing data sharing. The idea that this definition of social scoring will be expanded to all private and public sector applications is a pretty big change that warrants some consideration, especially since those definitions are unclear. When we're talking about this, you could argue that data brokerage companies that take data from one source and use it for another, this might be someone taking your Airbnb conversations, which aren't really private, by the way, and then selling that to another company which uses it to determine if you get refunds or a good customer in general, right? That's what we might be calling a private social scoring system. And those could be affected, and those might affect a broad number of platforms and a broad number of services, and could certainly have this sort of international effect. Okay, so that's on the EU AI Act. That's our big picture framing. So what's going on in the US? Some, but not as much, right? And it's all sectorally specific. We have an initiative on AI fairness coming from our employment agency, the EEOC. We have the Federal Trade Commission making some noise about fraud and discrimination, and then also some actual fines and requiring algorithmic deletions for privacy violations with data that's being used for AI. And they've started a broader rulemaking consideration. 5 financial regulators have also started a rulemaking consideration. And these efforts broadly fall under this sort of framing of an AI Bill of Rights that we've heard coming from the White House. Now that's interesting, but it's not a systemic action. Interestingly, there is Trump administration era guidance, an executive order called Maintaining American Leadership in AI, that is largely being ignored by American agencies. And it would be nice if they didn't ignore that, because it provides a detailed list of all the regulatory authorities that our agencies have over AI. Health and Human Services has responded. Its response is very detailed, very complicated across many laws, and it gives you a sense of how complicated this could get, and I would encourage US agencies to follow that. So a last thought, why is international alignment important? Well, I'd sort of just explain it, right? We have this complicated EU law, and just as the US in one example, a complicated sectorally specific agency level action. It's not to even mention the state level action, which is privacy and facial recognition bans. And then multiply this by every country in the world, which many of whom will have their own AI legislation. This is going to create some complicated barriers to trade and complicated sets of rules, especially on platforms that exist either internationally on the internet or use data internationally. So the barriers to trade are the obvious one. I'll mention quickly that regulatory overlap, especially true for platforms, might be helpful if we're working together on these things. The networks involved in big platforms don't just magically stop at national borders. And so maybe there's a regulatory benefit. It's not just about trade. Maybe our protections are stronger if we're working together. And also pointing in the same direction, if we start to work together on these issues, it could actually lead to better software tools. There's not as much investment as I'd like there to be in open source AI software for transparency, for bias detection, for evaluating data sets for these types of problems, just for improving the robustness and fairness and sort of ethical issues of AI generally. If we're all focused on the same issues, we might get some better AI software too. And we've heard regulatory sandboxes, an idea I find interesting, but also a little undeveloped. I'll leave the rest of my thoughts on how to do this for a little bit later, but hopefully that's a clear framing of the why, and just to say I'm excited to hear everyone else. And sorry I went just a little bit over.
No, that's great, Alex. Thank you. Yeah, we'll come back to this question to what extent you think the US and Europe might align going forward. But you set the scene really well there. So Vidushi, if I can turn to you actually and get your perspective, which I think will have a bit more of an Asian angle for us. So thanks, Vidushi.
Yeah, thank you, David, and thanks for having me. I was going to use my 4 to 5 minutes to talk about like kind of the big picture of like international cooperation and how we can think about that, and then also talk about what's happening in Asia broadly, but I'm going to focus on a few specific countries. So the question of like whether we need international cooperation, right? I feel like it's a really important one, and I was happy, David, when you contacted me for this, you said we're going to see whether it is even something that we want, right? And my answer to that is that we do need international cooperation and it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And the reason I say that is because, you know, we have, say, for instance, you think about like the huge market for import and export of AI systems. Alex just gave us a lot of examples wherein the same system or the same platform could be operating different places. So of course we need like, you know, an international kind of regulatory framework, which will help us make sense of this. And I would argue that, you know, if you look at international human rights, for instance, it is, you know, it's not a perfect system, it's not a perfect legal system or framework. However, it is the most universal framework that we do have. And then on the other hand, if you look at things like GPay, if you look at the OECD, there's a concerted effort to think about, you know, what does harmonized ethical principles for AI, what do they look like, right? But the tension really comes in when we stop to consider how contextual the use of AI systems are, and how the use of AI, you know, whether you're thinking of predictive policing or you're thinking about hiring tools, or you're thinking about credit scoring, so on and so forth, it also depends very, very strongly on the place which it is deployed. And so for going to look at the entire life cycle of design and then development and then deployment, I like to kind of draw a diagram where I say, you know, we have to think of the minimum, the absolute minimum requirement coming from, say, international human rights standards. That's the floor, right? It's the floor of the room that I'm trying to build for you here. And then we have ethical principles that talk about the ceiling of the room, right? So that's where we want to be. They're not really rooted in law, but they give us a good sense of where we want to be. And then we have to think of, say, technical standards that tell us how far we want to go and how we want to go as the walls of the room. So we have the ceiling, the floor, and the walls. And then the context of that specific use case of a particular AI system is what will determine how exactly we regulate it, right? So it's not that international cooperation can stand in for local regulation, but it is an important kind of vehicle through which we get there. And we're also kind of seeing, you know, I really appreciate your comments, Alex, in terms of like, will the Brussels effect really kick in? Because we definitely saw that with data protection. You know, it's still happening in India where I live. We're still kind of awaiting a data protection law that was modeled on the GDPR. The same is true for many, many countries in Asia. But in general, I think, you know, thinking of the first legislation globally that will talk about AI is also, you know, it makes sense to spend a lot of time thinking about it, because it does have an effect that I like to call the template effect, right? So it's almost like countries tend to take it and then use what works for them and change what doesn't. But it does start off as like kind of the basis of what regulation could look like. I'm going to quickly just say that when we think about the impact that this might have in Asia and how we can think about working together, the narrative in countries like India and Singapore and China is usually not human rights first, right? It's not democracy first. It's usually, for instance, in India, one of the policy documents that we had a couple of years ago said that we want to be a garage for testing AI applications, right? If you look at Singapore, innovation is very much at the forefront of it. If you look at China, most of the AI regulation and you know, kind of interest in AI comes from cybersecurity and more like consumer protection as opposed to democracy. So the guiding factor is, I think, a little bit different. And so I think, again, coming back to the context point, right, we can say that, like, of course, import and export and trade and stuff is important, but the driving force and the instruments that we use in order to kind of have some sort of regulation and enforcement of regulation will differ. And I'll save the rest of my comments for later. I think I went half a minute over, so thank you for your patience.
No, thanks, Vidushi. That's really good. Thank you for setting the scene there. And we will come back to some of those topics you raised. Let's hear from Juha now, our final lead speaker, before we get into the panel discussion. Juha, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, David. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. So let me just give you a bit of background, the rationale, if you like, why the European Union is doing this, why the European Commission has put forward this proposal for a regulatory framework, and what kinds of, if you like, what kind of motives are there behind it. So we all know that AI has a lot of promise. I don't think I need to explain that to you. So it's a technology which could greatly help us and help us address societal challenges, but it carries risks and it raises concerns, and those are all well known and well documented. And there are certain characteristics to artificial intelligence which make it, of course, a bit special. They are quite complex systems. There is certain capacity to these systems. They can be unpredictable. They can learn and they can change. They have autonomy and they can develop their features. And of course, they use a great deal of data, although, of course, there is also AI beyond these big data approaches that we're so familiar with, deep learning, machine learning. But nevertheless, a lot of the current approaches do use a lot of data. And this then poses certain risks to safety and fundamental rights, but it also causes legal uncertainty and enforcement issues, leading ultimately also to potentially mistrust. And it can also lead then to fragmentation. And from the perspective of the European Commission, fragmentation is one of the key aspects here. For the benefits of AI to materialize, we need uptake. So the technology needs to be put to good use. But a sine qua non for uptake is, of course, trust. So we need trust to have uptake, and we need uptake to have the benefits materialize. And therefore, we approach this question by means of this regulatory proposal. So we need to make sure that we can actually reap the benefits of this technology. And given the fact that the European Union is a union of 27 member states, it's not one single country, the fragmentation that I mentioned is a real problem here. So, as was already mentioned by the member of the European Parliament, there was the potential risk of the member states starting to legislate on artificial intelligence. So there could have been legal fragmentation. So we want to preempt fragmentation with this approach. And we want to make sure then that we have uniform rules that apply to artificial intelligence across the member states. So there is this legal aspect to it. So we want to make sure that we have a uniform legal framework applying to artificial intelligence. But there's more to that. So there's also the fact that we have an internal market in the European Union, and we want to make sure that this internal market for these products is not disrupted, but it's predictable and it stays a single market. So therefore, we want to make sure that through this proposal, we have also in this respect a context which is not fragmented. And of course, this is important from the research, industrial, and market aspect point of view of this technology. And this is, of course, it's quite easy to forget, perhaps, the European Commission is also doing a lot of other things than just legislating. The European Commission is also a significant funding agency. So we have a lot of investment in research and innovation in artificial intelligence through our framework programs, Horizon Europe, and also then the new digital program, which is more geared towards capacity building and deployment. So we want to make sure that through this, we have also the research and industrial aspects covered and strengthened in the European Union. It is often stated the European Union is not investing enough in AI. And it is true that private investment is still not sufficient. However, the public investment is quite strong, in fact, and the European Commission is investing about 1 billion euros per year in artificial intelligence in this framework period of 2021 to 27, and we want to increase the total investment in AI up to 20 billion annually by the end of this decade. And this would be then public and private combined. And this we, of course, for this we need to involve the member states. We've done so. So we have discussed with the member states. We have published a so-called coordinated plan with the member states, where there are commitments by the European Commission on the one hand, but also by the member states to stimulate investment and also take other necessary action to make sure that we stay at the forefront of this technology. So to sum up, there are economic, legal, and societal benefits to having this kind of approach. And of course, then there is the link to international, because we want to also internationally make sure that we promote ambitious global rules and standards in this field, and that we are at the forefront of advocating a rule-based approach, a human-centric approach to AI, trustworthy AI, as we call it. So I stop here and hand over back to you, Dave. Thank you.
Thanks, Juha. It's a very clear summary of the motivations behind the EU Act, so thank you for that. Alex, let's come back to this question of the transatlantic angle on this and the extent to which there may be alignment between the US and Europe. I mean, we've got the EU-US Trade and Technology Council discussing AI now. So how optimistic are you that there will be a degree of alignment around regulation and also best practice and other mechanisms as well?
Good question. Moderately confident, right? So the good news, the Trade and Technology Council Working Group 1 on technology standards explicitly says that AI is a key area of cooperation, identified in the first TTC meeting, and there'll be more conversations in the next meeting, which is in mid-May in Paris. And so I think there's a recognition that standards are one of the ways forward. You see the US national standards body NIST working very actively on AI issues, especially broadly in the category of whatever trustworthy, human-centric, whatever buzzword you're feeling, AI that's good, and so that's promising. And NIST and CENELAC, the European standards body, have worked together before, just off the top of my head, for smart grids recently. So I think there's a clear path forward to setting standards, which is definitional issues. It's making sure we're speaking the same core technical language and isn't necessarily the whole ballgame or really even close, but it's a good first step.
Okay.
Others have mentioned the OECD work, which I think is positive on measurement, and the GPI work, which the US joined under the Trump administration. And it's worth noting that wasn't guaranteed under the Trump administration. So the fact that they decided to join that sort of G7 oriented, France, Canada oriented project originally was positive. So some good signs even then. There are other things I would like to see. And I'll go back briefly to this Trump era guidance, but there's an executive order that should have led to the broad systemic understanding of how the US has the current legal authority to regulate algorithms. This isn't passing a new law, it's just seeing how current laws affect AI governance. And the Biden administration is, I'm a little surprised, maybe dragging its feet, or maybe it's just not currently the priority. And I think that's a necessary step we haven't seen. It might also not be a bad idea to appoint someone, an international AI regulatory coordinator, at least a part-time role, as we expect to see, in the US, again, these sectoral one agency at a time transitions, or even one state at a time transitions, and how those are going to align with, as we heard earlier from MVP Benify, what is going to be a complicated enforcement scheme in Europe as well. And so it's going to be complicated in the US, it's going to be complicated in Europe. They're going to be complicated in fundamentally different ways. And it might be a good idea to say, hey, someone, why don't you get on this? Some of the last broad point here, it is easier to prevent these types of non-tariff barriers to trade than it is to remove them once they are in place. I think that is borne out across many other topics. And so that's the argument here. Let's get someone who's going to pay attention and say, hey, we don't need friction here. We can avoid this and still get to our regulatory goals. So some progress. There's other things that we might like to see as well.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Juha, staying with this transatlantic angle for a moment, how much political will is there in Europe, do you think, to build a consensus with the US, particularly given the strength of the major US internet platforms? Is it a political priority for Europe to reach an agreement with the US on this?
So the European Commission is quite strongly engaged and involved in these discussions, and it has top-level political backing. It would not be happening otherwise. So obviously it is a priority in the European Commission, and it's being stated also clearly, and there is definitely the political will to discuss and to move things forward with the US in this regard. And not just with the US, we're also, of course, talking to other international partners, since you highlighted the Trade and Technology Council in particular. It is obviously something that now is high on the agenda. I should also point out that the work is led by two executive vice presidents at the European Commission. So in that sense, that shows you the kind of level of importance that it has on our side. I should perhaps also point out that things are not necessarily constant. I think Alex was already indicating this to some extent. Things have changed from what they were a few years ago. The US is also developing this Bill of AI rights, a work that started in the autumn, and so there are steps there which, from our perspective, perhaps go in the same direction as we've been moving things. So I think that the political will is something that is available now more than it was perhaps previously. And of course, I think that there is, due to a number of things that have happened, if we go back a few years, we had the Cambridge Analytica scandal, we had all kinds of other things, the GDPR entered into force, and all those things have changed the debate and changed the conversation to some extent, in the sense that if 5 years ago everyone was saying, why would you even consider regulating, because it's crazy given the context and the background, that debate, in my experience from the feedback that I received, the comments that I hear, has significantly changed.
So the mood music's changed. Okay, no, thanks, Johan. Let's turn now in particular to India, Vidushi, because India is a big player in the software industry, and I think you described it as it wanted to be a garage in some ways for innovation, etc. So, to what extent, first of all, do you see India regulating AI in a strong and meaningful way? And then, secondly, to what extent does India pay attention to what the EU is doing, for example, with the AI Act?
I think there is a lot of regulatory attention at the moment when it comes to getting in place a data protection law, right? I think an AI Act, a dedicated AI Act, is kind of like putting the cart before the horse, because right now, what we're trying to put in place is like a regulatory framework and an authority that can actually look into just basic data protection. And AI systems do feature roughly in the proposed data protection bill, particularly around like biometric data and things like that. So, facial recognition, voice-based recognition, those kinds of things I think will be regulated down the line. It's interesting because like there's a lot of interest in procuring a lot of, quote unquote, like advanced technology, right? You have different states in India that want to have a 360-degree view of citizens. The AI market in India is booming. You have lots and lots of startups coming up, kind of offering different kinds of solutions, whether it's credit scoring or predictive policing, and really across the board. But the main question right now is who can share the data, who can hold the data, and things like that on one end, where at the same time the market is growing at an alarming rate, right? So I think it's definitely a priority in terms of business. Also, I mean, I think it's important to keep in mind that the business incentives to reducing friction between different countries is particularly, baked in as one of the big incentives, regardless of like what kind of regulation we're talking about or what kind of specific AI system we're talking about, right? So, so that is on one hand when it comes to like regulation in particular, but I think there is a lot of interest in what is happening in the EU just because of the effect that we saw the GDPR have. Also, there's a lot of import and export between the EU and India, of course, as we all know. So I don't think that it will, I mean, this is just a hunch. I have no research to back it up, but just from like, focusing on the kinds of conversations that happen around data protection and the kinds of conversations that have happened around AI. I don't know if the same template effect will happen where, like we just take the same act and change a few things, because the priorities and the guiding principles are different, right? So it's more safety, security, business growth, and things like that. But there's definitely interest in the EU. There's definitely interest. India's also a part of JPA, so there's definitely interest in like international cooperation. I just think it might be a little more layered than, say, data protection.
Yeah, and looking elsewhere in Asia beyond India, do you regard particular Asian countries as being out in front of the AI issue as the potential regulatory trendsetters from an Asian dimension? I mean, obviously South Korea's got a very advanced AI industry, for example. Where should we be looking in Asia to understand where, the regulatory innovation, for want of a better word, might come from?
I mean, I think I mentioned Singapore just because it's such a hub for, it's kind of like the gold standard of how governments should use AI or how businesses should be able to thrive and use AI systems. They have a lot of incubators. The startup culture is pretty big. And also, I think the government in Singapore is so deeply steeped in AI solutions that's an important place to look. Of course, China is a huge market. And, I think the tendency to just say, well, China is, going to do whatever it wants. It doesn't care about rights. I think it's dangerous to be overly simplistic about it, especially when you look at it from the point of view of consumer protection and national security. They also have, some kind of regulatory movement around algorithmic systems. So definitely those places. I will say though that I've been studying like how smart cities and things like that, commercial applications within smart cities travel within Asia, and like looking at policy windows like safe cities, for instance, is a really, I think, important exercise to carry out, because the way in which like this technology travels, keep in mind, a lot of countries in Asia don't have data protection, right? So the barriers to entry and movement and growth of markets is so low compared to the rest of the world, that it's important to kind of pay attention to how it's growing and who are the entities that are kind of pushing for its growth.
Yeah. Okay. No, thanks, Vidusha. That's a really good overview there. Alex, if I can come to you on China, actually, because I think China is a particularly interesting one. And MEP Benefi mentioned this, that China has actually become more proactive, I think. But is there any prospect of a kind of high-level sort of consensus between China and the US and Europe and some of this stuff, would you say?
That is a good question. I am not particularly optimistic about that. There is a broader effort, both reflected in the EU approach to legislating and digital governance, which is not just the AI Act, but also the Digital Service and Digital Markets and Data Governance Act. That's a broad approach to saying we're going to apply rules that are protect our citizens and are non-discriminatory and protect democracy, as we just heard MEP Benefi say he'd like to see more focus on. And the European Union is willing to do that with legislation and to use its citizens and its market and its wealth as a little bit of a cudgel to say we're gonna shift our market and our influence and to move AI in this direction. The US has maybe a less strong claim at the moment about its willingness to do that, to move everything in that direction. There are some things it's doing. It's antitrust lawsuits against Facebook from the FTC as an example I didn't mention. Some of these regulatory steps, right? The US is kind of willing to do it. And we also might see a renewed effort from the US called the Alliance for the Future of the Internet, driven by Tim Wu, in which it would be at least a statement of principles and getting countries on board around the internet and algorithms and what the sort of global landscape could look like if we all came together. And I bring that up because, if you ask the people working on this, would China be involved? Do we think that China gets to be in this group? There's a lot of hemming and hawing and nervousness, and you don't really get an answer from the policymakers, maybe because they haven't decided, but also because I think they really struggle to include China, even with its current data protections and algorithm protections that we've heard about. They struggle to include it in this broader framing without some of the core underlying democratic institutions that we know China does not have. And so I think there are global efforts to move some of these issues in a pro-democracy way, and also in a setting of international standards around AI that's coming both from the US and the EU. And they don't want to exclude China. I don't think people want to say, oh, China automatically doesn't get to come, but they are nervous about how China could possibly be included in this framework, even if they have tech-specific regulations without the underlying democratic institutions that we sort of think about as necessary to make these systems fair. So it's an interesting, and in my sense, I see it as a somewhat awkward space for policymakers who understand that China is important and don't want to dissuade China from taking these steps, but aren't really sure that this is that these actions are equivalent, despite the fact that they kind of seem equivalent on paper. So complicated answer there, but it's a good question. I'd love to hear what the other panelists have to say about it.
Yeah, no, thanks, Alex. I think as Vidushi mentioned, the cart before the horse, and with data, and but also there's the ethics and the human rights cart and horses as well, of course, in a lot of this context. Let's just get a view from you, Har, as to whether there's a concern within the EU that a more laissez-faire approach in different parts of the world, potentially in Asia, might see them actually gain some kind of competitive advantage from an economic perspective or a technical perspective with AI. Do you worry that a more freewheeling approach in other regions might leave the EU trailing behind in any respect?
So I think it's quite common for this antagonism to be presented. So either you regulate or you innovate. And I think that from our perspective, there are a couple of things I'd like to highlight in that regard. So first of all, we try to reach the right balance, strike the right balance between innovation and regulation. And we think that this is doable, and we think that this is the right way for us to do AI, because we need to do AI that is in a way that is right for Europeans. And I've been on a number of panels where this kind of sort of, I would maybe call it a false dichotomy, has been refuted soundly by also people who don't necessarily come from the background of human rights aspects or fundamental rights aspects, but more also from the, let's say, the business side of things. And I think that I've seen, also heard these comments, and I certainly think that also regulation can enable innovation. So in that regard, it is not necessarily something to be seen just as a bad thing, but it can also have an effect, a positive effect, if it's done in the right way. And I could perhaps also refer to what I said earlier by stating that things are not necessarily constant. So I think that it can be seen that there is perhaps more appetite now to regulate AI in a reasonable way, not just in Europe but also elsewhere. Currently, as has been pointed out, the US is not doing that, for example. On the other hand, at the level of independent states, there is regulation enacted, and some of that actually goes very much in the same direction as the AI Act has outlined in the text that has been published. So in that regard, things are not necessarily constant, they are moving. And I think that there is perhaps more of a realization that a completely laissez-faire approach might not be in the best interest of most of us.
Okay, no, thanks you. Vidushi, I just want to touch on the question of whether developing countries such as India and Africa or Latin America, for example, should take a different approach to the developed world, and whether, for all sorts of economic, developmental, cultural reasons, etc., you can't just take AI regulation from Europe, for example, and transplant it to a developing country. And what's your view on that?
Yeah, in general, I'm quite skeptical, or very skeptical, I should say, of taking, whether it's regulation or AI models from one place and trying to use them in another. One of the examples I always give to kind of demonstrate this is when I was looking at credit scoring in India. I spoke to a lot of companies that use credit scoring models that they got from Lendo in the US, or, similarly placed companies in the US. And they found that, like, an instance or an indication of a person being creditworthy in the US is like, do you go to the same place every day and come back to the same place? So, do you have a job? Do you pay your bills on time and things like that? And when they try to apply it to India, they found that actually the people who need alternate credit are not people who have credit files. And so often those people, kind of like work from home. And so they don't even have mobile phones, because usually mobile phones are a family kind of device as opposed to an individual device and things like that, right? They actually found that in India, if someone calls their mother more than 3 times a day, they tend to be a good credit risk. I mean, that's like a very, lighthearted and bad example, but just to say that, like, these things are very, very contextual. And I think the dangers of kind of applying a one-size-fits-all approach to regulation is similarly dangerous, also given the fact that, like, the foundation of the floor that I spoke about, right, whether it's constitutional law or contract law, business ethics, or whatever it is that is in the particular context of that country or that state or that city, is very different from what we're imagining at a high level. So I think, like, when we build up, like, taking into account the contextual reality within which you want to regulate systems is really important. And of course, that's much easier said than done. But for instance, if we were to take in, like, EU AI regulation in India, and we don't even have data protection, then, like, how does that work? It is an awkward fit, because it's just not a critically, it's not one that has been critically thought through. So yeah, I think to answer your question in a fairly succinct way, I would say that countries that are in different cultural contextual realities than, say, the EU or the US or Australia, or whichever country we're thinking about, I think you need to build up instead of, like, imposing it in a top-down fashion.
Yeah. No, thanks, Vidushi. That's really helpful. I just want to take some of the audience questions, actually, because we're running a little bit short time for this panel. But so there's one, I think, which is generally around law enforcement and international cooperation across borders, where we potentially got maybe legal AI being used in that context, and maybe within the context of different legal or regulatory frameworks. I mean, maybe I'll start with Alex, or maybe Juha on this, but to what extent is, because of crime is clearly international, cybercrime is clearly international, to what extent is there a real need for coordination from a kind of policing use of AI or a security use of AI? Alex or Juha, do you want to take that one? I think Alex was indicating you. Is that right? Or do you want to come in on that? Maybe you take that one. Do you see that as off topic? Okay. I don't. It doesn't sound like the panelists want to address that. So maybe
I can take a quick shot at it. So,
yeah,
but Juha may have better thoughts. It is important. There is a growing recognition that governments should disclose what they're doing with algorithms, especially for important human services and government services. The EU AI Act speaks to this significantly. A lot of the high-risk services in the EU AI Act are, in fact, government services. They're access to important public benefits, right? So if you're doing some sort of fraud detection for benefits, they talk about first responders, they talk about utilities and critical infrastructure. That's important. Those are indeed high risk. And there are cities that are doing things like an algorithmic registry, where you write down all the ways you're using algorithms and you make that public for public feedback and public criticism. Germany is one of the biggest countries that has ever done this. They did it kind of by accident, but a member of the Bundestag asked for a list of all the government's uses of algorithms, and their federal government responded, and a list of 90 some uses and a bunch of pilot projects around algorithms. The US is also supposed to be doing this, but is dragging its feet. Now that's broadly the use of AI, but the first step is to make it public how you do it. And then I am hoping that that process leads to better standards. This isn't something with an obvious international impact most of the time. David makes a good point about law enforcement. I haven't thought about that much. That's a good point where this does become an international issue. I am just hoping that countries, by raising the bar, create higher standards for us to hold one another to. And I do think that's something the EU AI Act clearly does, which I think would help other civil society activists hold their own government's feet to the fire, and is largely missing. There is a bill in the US that actually has been around since 2007 that requires documentation of algorithms used in law enforcement that most people seem to have forgotten about, but it's narrowly targeted and not also followed entirely either. So it'd be nice to see that expanded. But it's a good question. The international component on law enforcement is a good one and not one that I'd considered.
Yeah, I think the question is, sorry, you're going to go?
Sorry, I don't have really much to add to that. I think it goes well beyond my remit, to be honest, because it's a much bigger and much broader issue. And I agree with also what Alex said about the way that the AI Act would contribute to this. I should maybe just point out that also, in the Trade and Technology Council statement on AI, it was stated that the EU and the US are sort of advocate a responsible stewardship of AI and are opposed to use of AI which don't comply with our fundamental values and human rights. So that's one thing. And of course, there is a working group in the TTC discussions, which is looking at things like surveillance technologies, and misinformation. So these aspects are also part of the discussions with the US.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very, very rich topic. I think there's questions around what counts as evidence or what could count as evidence, what's being collected with using AI, etc. But yeah, no, that is somewhat specialist. There is one other question that I just want to deal with coming through the chat before we switch to the other panel, which is more a philosophical one around, do we pursue autonomy for the sake of autonomy sometimes, or whether actually we should be saying that these systems should have human insight as a default, or human oversight, I should say, as a default, rather than be pursuing autonomy for the sake of it. I might just start with you on that, Fiducia, actually, because I mean, you come at this from a kind of, let's say human perspective. Are we trying too much for autonomy? Is it kind of, a goal that we should it not be the be all and end all, as it were?
I think this is a case where we're kind of overselling what AI is and what it isn't. I think it's like, another example of putting the cart before the horse, because I think if you look at like technical definitions of machine learning, it says that, these systems are capable of improving their performance of a task over time, or changing or adapting to how they perform a task over time based on the data you're given. And we can get into the computer science of it, but I think autonomy is something that it means something completely different, right? It means that it doesn't have to be explicitly programmed, it doesn't have to be programmed at all. We're assuming it has legal personality, and like none of that is true. If we look at like how AI is spoken about in the media right now, one of the good metrics that I was taught very, very early on in my journey is that if you're reading about AI and its capabilities in the mass media, you're probably reading an exaggerated false version of it, because right now what we have are sophisticated systems, yes, but sophisticated within very, very narrow domains. So I think if we're trying to talk about autonomy, we're really missing the point, because very, very narrow, very unglamorous AI systems, whether it's credit scoring systems or predictive policing systems, are the ones that actually have implications in societies and for individuals and communities. We can think about robots and stuff in the year 3000 maybe, but for now what we need to think about is how to regulate very sophisticated but very non-science fiction-y technical systems. Yeah, okay, let's stick with the here and now on that. Okay, now unless there's any quick comments from you, Hara and Alex, on that point. I see Alex sort of voiced his agreement in the chat there, but I'm going to thank our first panel for their contributions today. Apologies for the delayed start, but thank you for all your insights, and obviously you're very welcome to stay for the second segment and ask any questions there if you wish. But it's been a very insightful discussion. I should have said at the start, by the way, I'll be writing this up and we'll publish an article on Science Business in which will capture some of the key takeaways, and there'll also be a recording of this webinar available through Science Business as well. So, but thank you guys for your insights. We'll now turn to the second segment, which is going to be very much about translating the theory into action and progress. The lead speakers for this segment, Evert Stamhuis, he's
full professor at the Erasmus School of Law at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. We also have Raja Shatila. He's a professor emeritus at the Sorbonne University, and Karine Pesse. She's the head of unit for AI policy observatory at the OECD. So thank you all. Thank you to all of them for joining us today. As I say, this second segment is going to be focused very much on how we're actually achieving international harmonization, some of the mechanisms for that, and looking ahead to the progress that we might make in the next few years. So we're going to get 4 or 5 minutes opening remarks from each of the speakers, beginning with Evert. So Evert, let's start with you.
Thanks so much. If I can have my slide on the screen. I just let's say I limited myself very much and tried to get to the point of the Draft AI Act more specifically, and of course it will tie very much with the discussion that we've had in the previous segment of this very interesting webinar. Thank you so much for organizing it. Thank you so much for inviting me. In general, I would say on the Draft AI Act, I still have some doubts. I harbor some doubt with regard to whether the technology is so specific that it really merits its dedicated regulation. And a couple of the things that came across in the debate before my presentation, they actually mirror my doubts, and they even increase them. For example, your question, Alex, about this law enforcement issue. Let's say it's a technology in the hands of some agencies that actually perform cross-border activities. Law enforcement is a cross-border activity, and criminal investigations are, but that is nothing new. It does not come new with the technology. It was already there when we started exchanging information. And of course, it is good that you agree upon a minimum level of safeguards with regard to the evidence collection across the borders or so. But in the end of the day, what is the normative as well as the practical environment in which you will exercise and adopt and adapt these technologies will certainly be a mix of any act, but much more dominated by specific regulation, like, for example, the regulation on the viability of criminal evidence in front of national courts. So this is just an example to show that I still have some doubts with regard to whether the current approach of the EU in a specific dedicated regulation for AI is indeed bringing us strong and meaningful regulation, as you just said previously, Alex. But anyway, it is on the table, and there is, let's say, I could say, there is a lot to be said in favor, but also against it. So I would say, given this broader context, first of all, I would say some legislative action is better than nothing. So I just go down for the slides to show my opinion on the upsides and the downsides. And I think my first upside connects to what Juha has said about market regulation. So in order to prevent a race to the bottom inside the common market in the European Union, it is good that we act. So in that respect, it is better than nothing, because silence is not a good idea. Because of the, let's say, the divergent effects that you may expect in that as a consequence on the market, but also in respect to this sort of overcoming the frame that Juha has and I very much agree with what he said, the frame of that regulation is against innovation. That's just a frame. It is not sustained with evidence that it's going to be, that is true for once and for all. And there are sufficient examples of the opposite. So in that way, I would never repeat saying that innovation or regulation it's a zero-sum game. There is, of course, enough evidence saying that the regulation is the mother of innovation. Secondly, what you could count as an upside has already been discussed in the previous part, is the attempt to set the tone and push the Brussels effect. And it has, of course, to do with an attempt to sort of shape the market in terms of industrial production of these models and these systems, as well as to make it attractive for companies to adapt because of the market that Euro provides. It is something that you could do and cynically approach as saying, okay, This is all that the European Union can do, given the backlash that it has already in the field of developing AI because of the late start of the development industry, as well as the late start of real investment in it. But in any way, it is a reflection of, let's say, the way in which we view the good life. And that is a representation of the political consensus that we were able to achieve on the national and on the communitarian level. And finally, one of the upsides, as I see it, is that banning is an option. And that is against anything of, let's say, technological determinism or techno-pessimism or things like so that things happen anyway. And I would say a strong statement that things do not happen anyway, and that to let technology have its go is already a political decision in itself, is clearly expressed if you say we ban certain technologies. Although they are developed, although they are out there, although others may not ban them, we do. But of course, there are some downsides to it on the right-hand side of my slide. And of course, I am still in doubt whether this approach of standardization and certification mechanisms is really working out well. What are we actually certifying? Is it the models? Is it the systems? And of course, there is a lot of diversity in the actual systems, because these AI models, they will be trained and then they will be adapted to specific applications. You mentioned law enforcement. The applications in the medical sector are far beyond, let's say, starters level. There are a lot of them, a lot of success, a lot of investment at the moment in further developing them. But they show a large, let's say, diversity, a huge diversity in terms of their risk, and thus that diversity is not reflected in the risk categories. We have only 3 risk categories, or let's say 2, no-goes, high risk and low risk. And I think there is much more diversity to it, and you cannot achieve that by certification if you have these sort of simple you cannot achieve any certainty if you have those simple categories. But I can understand how it works. In terms of standardization and certification, you want to give a message to the industry, to the developing industry, particularly the engineers who develop the models, those who are involved in selling and training and improving those models. They look for certainty, and it was also what Juha said earlier. And legal certainty is one of the aims of the regulation. But whether this is going to indeed bring legal certainty, because in all sectors, I have some doubts, and I doubt whether this CE approach is really bringing that. And that connects to my second downside, which is a standardization or a certification is a frozen moment. This is a model or a process or system that we certify. But then what happens if the process changes or the model improves itself? And not immediately talking about autonomy or not. And this is indeed, autonomy is what you give to a system and not what the system has. So, but whether the system has capacities or not to improve itself is already, I think, beyond debate. So if the system is fluid, what is the value of a CE certification given at a certain moment in time? So in that end, maybe you would only certify that the process of constant improvement and the reiterations to the adoption of the normative standards are there, and whether they are successfully applied or not is maybe hard to get security about or get certainty about with the CE certificate. And in the end, of course, this was also already mentioned by Juha, is the accountability and the legitimacy of the certification system itself. And so where do those standards come from? What if those standards are changed? There is a mechanism of experts being involved in setting new risk categories or changing risk categories. And of course, there is this, I say, direct implications for the lives of individuals and citizens and corporations, and that would require a high level of accountability and legitimacy that I find hard to discover in the regulation as I imagine it to be applied, let alone that there is something like a coordination with all kinds of sectoral agencies that have to take place in order to get systems admitted or certified to the market. And there, I think, even there, it would be only for the superly specialized industrial, let's say, the European affairs specialists of these various highly developed industries that are able to find the places where those categories are set, where those norms are set. And that is a bit of a downside to the legitimacy and accountability if anything goes wrong. Thank you so much. I think I have stuck within my time frame. So fine.
Thanks, Everett. No, that's a really good insight into the pros and cons of the regulatory approach, which other regions also need to think about, clearly. Now let's get some opening remarks from Raja. Obviously, well, I say obviously, but he's involved in GPAI, the global partnership, so it'd be interesting to get his perspective on the effectiveness of that. Raja, floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and happy to speak about these topics, which raise so many controversies, actually. Well, I think that, well, first, let me state that I'm unoptimistic. And when I look around what's happening, I see a lot of progress for shared principles. For example, the OECD principles, which are very close to those which have been defined by the high-level expert group on AI with the European Commission, who has inspired the EU AI Act. And actually, the EU AI Act has adopted mostly the OECD definition of AI, which also are the basis for GPAI. So this is an example of how international coordination happens without someone being in charge, actually, explicitly. It's people who are in different committees, different organizations, who came up with those principles and those definitions, and who converged, actually, together. And when the GPAI was installed, the GPAI adopted the OECD principles because they are overreaching and because many countries approve of those principles. Also, there is a progress about understanding governance mechanisms. For example, the AI Act follows a risk-based approach, as you know. Well, guess what? 5 days ago, NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the United States, has issued an AI risk management framework. And this is a draft which is currently under discussion. But this means also that we have shared concepts that are stemming from research, studies, and common approaches, actually. Progress is happening also in standards and certification. It's not something that is yet to be achieved. And standards and certifications are a means for soft governance, but a combination of bottom-up approaches, such as codes of conduct, transparency declarations, are in the AI Act, and top-down approaches, such as mandatory certification, which can actually require that those common standards, common certification processes are approved of. Well, this is happening in some international bodies, such as ISO, the IEEE, who involve multi-stakeholder participation, including industry, academia, official bodies, and they are currently developing techno-ethical standards. For example, the IEEE in late 2021 has issued a standard about a model-based process to take into account ethical considerations in AI system approach development. So again, this can be exploited for the sake of implementing an act, an AI act, or for the sake of a bottom-up approach, because companies, industry might adopt standards without this to be mandatory. Well, actually, why is this progress happening? Because I think it is in the interest of all parties that there is an uptake of AI technology. Why? Well, because this technology is both economically and socially important. It is also in the economical interest of developing countries to be part of the international setting. So they are joining this setting. And the other point is how the mechanisms that I have just mentioned, and specifically GPI, since I'm co-chair of the Responsible AI Working Group. Actually, the full name is Responsible Development and Use of AI, the Responsible Governance, Development, and Use of AI Working Group at the GPI. The Global Partnership on AI actually is something that is building this common understanding by acting. And by acting, developing projects that respect human rights, that are socially preferable and environmentally friendly, addressing common good, for example, in areas where the UN Sustainable Development Goals are the target, projects for data sharing, for understanding AI impact on work and on jobs, orientations for reskilling, for example. Also understanding how we can incentivize financially and at the international level such projects, which really means that there, again, by doing, we understand how we can reach common agreement. Last but not least, just to conclude, I think a final point to be mentioned is education. Education will certainly influence the future and how AI is developed and how AI is managed and how it is regulated and how it is governed. And I think that there is already a lot happening within educational institutions, universities, for example. Within Europe, we have a set of universities coming up with a common understanding on curricula. International organizations such as the UNESCO, the IEEE could collaborate with that for qualification programs in businesses dealing with AI technology to educate employees, for example, including ethics and human rights in the degrees of data and AI scientists, and also, of course, supporting K-12 educational curricula and public awareness. So these are a few points I wanted to raise to just insist on the fact that many things are already going on, and this will have a strong impact on the future governance of AI. Thank you.
Thanks, Raja. Yeah, there's a lot of mechanisms actually in play and a lot of moving parts. As you say, there's more to it than simply regulation, of course. But let's turn to Karine now and get her opening remarks. Karine's obviously engaged with the OECD, and she can give, who's been looking at high-level principles for AI for some time. So she can give us a view on how much engagement there is from the OECD members on that. Karine?
Okay, thank you very much, David. Well, hello to everyone. So what I'll say, I think, is very much in line with what Raja just said. So a few surprises. So I'll share briefly a little bit of what we've been doing at the OECD on Trustworthy AI. Basically, since May 2019, when we adopted the OECD AI principles that were the basis for the G20 AI principles, we've been focusing on helping policymakers to implement beneficial and trustworthy AI. And I'll mention 3 key projects that I think are most relevant to today's panel on promoting international consensus on AI where we can. And I would say more than consensus is interoperability. And then I think where the red lines are going to be set is really going to depend on the jurisdictions and their values at the national level. But as long as our key focus is really on this interoperability, using the same terms to mean the same thing, even if we set, the red lines and what's okay or not okay at different levels, and that's bound to happen. So the first key focus area I think to mention is classifying AI systems according to their impact on public policy areas and developing a risk assessment framework. The second that I'll mention focuses on tools for trustworthy AI and on governance mechanisms to ensure accountability for trustworthy AI. And the third is really on international and intergovernmental cooperation. So as I said, the first key focus area is classifying AI systems according to their impact on public policy areas and developing a risk assessment framework. And the rationale to classify AI systems is that there's so many different types of AI systems that do very different things and raise really different policy considerations, from voice assistants to cancer diagnosis systems. They use different data, different models, they operate in different contexts, and they have different tasks and outputs with hugely different policy opportunities and challenges. And so policymakers really need to understand the benefits and challenges at a pretty fine-grained level to be able to move the ball forward towards trustworthy AI. Maybe not today, but as AI permeates all sectors of economy and society, it will be really important to have a more fine-grained understanding of what technical characteristics raise what type of policy considerations. So this framework helps assess different types of AI systems according to their impact on policy, specifically human rights, bias, safety, and accountability. And the goal is, as I said, facilitating more precise policy debate to help develop policies and regulations potentially. So as Raja mentioned, this framework builds on previous OECD work, including the definition of an AI system that we developed in 2019, which is quite broad, but at any case, the classification framework is a high-level framework with 5 key dimensions. At the core, people and planet. This is about how people as a whole are use and are affected by AI systems, and this focuses on human rights, well-being, and the environment. The next dimension is, is the economic context of an AI system, including the sector in which the system is implemented and how widely it is deployed. And next is the data and input that flow from the context to the AI model, including how the data is collected and whether the data is personal data, and a number of other questions about that data or input in the form of human expertise. And then the next dimension is the model itself, the AI model and the technologies that are used in it, including the type of model and the model building process. And the last dimension is the task and output that flow from the AI model back to the context or the environment, the real world or simulated world. And that includes the tasks the AI systems perform, such as recognition or personalization, and how much autonomy the system has, like with a driverless car or other autonomous systems. And we can map, what's interesting is we can map the key dimensions of this framework to different stages of the AI system lifecycle to help identify some of the key actors relevant to each dimension. And this is really important for accountability and risk management measures. And we see some convergence in ISO and NIST, for example, on leveraging the AI system lifecycle for risk management as the common framework, and then conducting risk assessments on each phase of the AI system lifecycle. If it would be I think visuals would be helpful, but I'm sorry I don't have any for today. But also in the EU AI Act context, I think it's worth emphasizing that this framework is mostly relevant to classifying specific AI applications, and that's something that's come out in the EU AI Act also, in the distinction between foundational AI models and the difficulty in assessing those and regulating those, because they could be applied in so many different ways. So I wanted to mention that. So the next steps on the classification are: 1, developing a risk assessment framework and an AI incidence tracker. And the goal of that incidence tracker is to inform this risk assessment work by tracking AI risks that have materialized into incidents and monitoring this to help inform policy and regulatory choices. So just really quickly, I realize I'm actually out of time, but I just want to say a few words about the tools for trustworthy AI. And so we've been building a catalog of tools for trustworthy AI to provide a repository of key tools to implement trustworthy AI, and structured methods that can be leveraged to help ensure AI systems are trustworthy, from technical standards or technical tools, including standards and certification schemes, to procedural tools to education and awareness building tools. And this, we plan to launch this late 2022, and we've also started analytical work on auditing AI systems, again, leveraging the AI system lifecycle. And then the third project, just to mention in a minute, is coordinating closely with our colleagues from a number of different IGOs, 8 of them, and hopefully soon the GPay as well. And so we've built a neutral platform providing access to information and resources on the AI policy initiatives from all these intergovernmental and regional organizations that have complementary mandates. So with that, sorry for going over. Back to you, David.
No worries. Thanks, Corinne. Right, so we've set the scene here. Let's just get into a few of the topics raised. And I think the first one is really around definitions of AI. And one of the criticisms of the EU Act has been, some people say it defines AI too broadly, others say it defines AI too narrowly. I think there's a question internationally for GPay, OECD and others about whether you can actually build a common definition of what an AI system is and where to draw the lines. Maybe I'll just start quickly with Evet on that. Do you think it's possible to build a cast iron definition of an AI system that can be used internationally?
No, simply the short answer is no, because of the fluidity of the technology. But that does not mean we have, let's say, in the legal toolbox, we have a couple of things then to respond to these kinds of uncertainties. You could have a sunset regulation or temporary regulation or responsive regulation. So there are some toolboxes with tools in the kit with which to respond to this uncertainty. But let's say a definition for a longer period of, let's say, more than 5 years is going to be totally unviable. And that's one of the difficulties with European legislation, is the process of getting it enacted is so complicated that there is a huge resistance in, let's say, quickly modifying it, which usually brings the European institutions to allocating these kinds of flexibility to bylaws and let's say, the side mechanisms. But this is so fundamental, this is hard to say we can put this in the side mechanism. Because then, again, we come to the point that I mentioned, that fundamental choices have to be made on the highest political level and with a democratic legitimacy.
Yeah. Okay, no, thanks. Let's just get Raj's thoughts on that. I mean, you're presumably seeing this in GPay. Is there a consensus as where you draw the lines on an AI system?
Well, yes, the definition of AI is something that is both difficult and simple. Why is it difficult? Because it includes many techniques stemming from applied mathematics and computer science and also robotics. So it's very wide, and all these are evolving. But mind you, since 2012, when we started to speak about deep learning, etc., AI didn't change much. We are speaking about the same systems as 10 years ago. So when I hear that it's a technology that changes all the time, well, I'm dubious. The principles are known. Yes, things change, but it's not because the change is here that it is fundamentally changing the definition of what AI is. And in defense of the AI Act, there is a general definition, but then there is this appendix that defines a little bit better the technologies that are underlying the AI system, and this can evolve very quickly. So I don't think that AI systems are something that is really changing form all the time, and we don't know how to define it. I think 10 years is pretty long time, right? And it didn't really fundamentally change.
All right, I want to bring in Corinne, not necessarily on the definition of AI per se, but this definition of risks and the different approaches to risk and how you think about that. Within the OECD members, is there a common view of how we should think about risk? And I think Evet raised this question as to whether you need a more fine-grained approach to risk, and you might have maybe 5 or 6 categories of risk rather than 2 or 3, for example. But how much consensus is there within the OECD on how we categorize risk?
On the AI front specifically, I don't think we're there yet. We're trying to develop a more a more, again, future-proof, fine-grained levels of risk based on evidence. And this is work that, you know, is ongoing. So it's ambitious and it will take a little bit of time. And this is obviously in cooperation with the Commission and other partners. And so I don't think we can say at this point in time precisely, but I have to say that we have a wealth of experience in assessing risk in many different other areas of policy, be it consumer product safety or chemical safety or aviation safety. And so and there are of course specificities to AI systems, but there are also a lot of commonalities and lessons to be learned from many of these frameworks. And that's what we're trying to do, is learn the lessons from, you know, this wealth of evidence on assessing risk elsewhere. Maybe just to mention about the definition is that we worked at the OECD on defining an AI system in 2018 and 19. It was difficult. It was very difficult to generate a consensus among experts and member countries and, well, multi-stakeholder group of experts. And I think that in the guiding principles for the definition, which is high level, that we came up with, was really that the high level nature of it and the future proofness of it, and that it would need the specific underlying, as Raja said, the specific underlying technologies may need to evolve. But another point that was really important that came out very strongly in our work back, you know, again, back several years back, was, you know, that we did not want to include just machine learning or, you know, the statistical AI. We wanted to have, you know, we wanted to be future proof in the sense of incorporating both symbolic AI systems or more traditional AI and this statistical AI, and to accommodate for what's coming up, the hybrid AI systems and things like that. And so it, you know, there was that was very prominent in the discussions, and I think it's worth just recalling, even though it's a bit dated now.
Yeah, no, thank you. I want to jump topics because we're short of time, actually. I just want to talk a little bit about developing countries. And Corinne, I'll just stay with you if I may. I know the OECD's members are predominantly developed countries, but what level of engagement are you getting from the developing world, Africa, Latin America, developing Asia? To what extent are they engaging with your work on AI?
We have a lot of engagement from Latin America, a lot of engagement from Southeast Asia, in the sense of India's participating actively. Thailand is an active participant in all of our work. Many countries like Egypt are also key participants. Latin America, we have three new countries joining the OECD. We now have at least half of Latin America that's OECD membership. So OECD has a reputation of being developed countries, but increasingly, you know, with Mexico, Peru, Costa Rica, Colombia, etc., you know, that is changing and broadening, and Brazil is now an accession candidate, so it's begun the process to become an OECD member. So there is strong engagement. I would say that there's been traditionally a bit less engagement with the African region compared to the other regions, and that that is one priority for, you know, engaging further.
Yeah. Okay. No, thanks, Corinne. Evan, I just want to turn to you. I mean, you talked about the EU AI Act up front and some of the pros and cons of that. To what extent do you think it will become a template for other parts of the world, and particularly developing countries? I mean, we mentioned Africa there, for example. If Africa looked at the GDPR and or parts of Africa have looked at it and taken elements of that, can you see that happening with the AI Act as well?
I would say the determining factors are to be discovered here. And unfortunately for us lawyers, the quality of the regulation in itself is hardly ever a determining factor for that. It is, I think you could say that it is let's say the distribution of economic interest and something of the political appreciation of it. And to start with the latter, you could say that there is we sometimes hear voices, particularly from South Africa, saying that these debates and these acts and these regulations are so much dominated by the intention to regulate and to facilitate the industry that is dominated by Western countries from, let's say, the global north, from and models that are trained with data that have had no impact whatsoever from populations or people or economic situations from the global south, etc. That, let's say, that there can be no political appreciation. But that's it. It's a bit hard to get a grip on, but it is a relevancy there because you see that in the debate coming with those contributions to the discourse from South Africa, for example. Secondly, is the economic interests, of course, and if the AI Act is in such a way impacting our industrial market for it that it is attractive to adapt your standards of output as an industry to this sort of well appreciated European level, then there is a mechanism inside specific industries to say, okay, this is then our way of doing business and our output, and we bring this output with a good story to the developing countries. But that is, let's say, a mechanism that you also see in the GDPR, and this is the core of the Brussels effect, but that is driven by economic interests. So it's either cost reducing or creating more opportunities for business, and then it will work beneficial, and it would have a sort of an effect on the narratives, on the regulatory narratives in the global south or in developing countries. And so far, for me, it's very hard to discover whether this is already, let's say, substantially going on or not.
Yeah. Okay. So the jury's still out on that one, as far as you're concerned.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Raja, if I can just bring you in on that. Again, well, as I say, I was slightly short of time, so I'm going to jump topics slightly. But in terms of the global partnership, GPay, how much impact do you think it will have in, let's say, the 3 to 5 year time frame? I mean, it's created a forum, obviously, a place where countries can get together and work together. What does success look like in that time frame for you?
Well, at this time, I would say that we have working groups who are actively producing reports and studying different issues. I don't have time to go into the details, but all the reports are on the web. It's gpi.ai, and you can reach out to this website and look on all the reports. The measure of success, I would say, is the uptake by governments and other stakeholders. GPI is young. We have yet to put in place the mechanisms that enable the stakeholders and the government to actually put together a framework for taking into account those reports, and with the OECD as well, putting them into practice. And this is why actually we are asked to be providing practical projects. And this, well, it's too early to say, but that's the challenge, I think. Our challenge in terms of experts, and the challenge the member countries as well.
Okay, no, thank you. There's a couple of audience questions I want to take before I get to a final question for the panel, which is a forward-looking question, just to conclude. But let's take the audience questions first, which is, one is around this issue of classification and how we, if the technology is changing quickly, how we actually go about agreeing at an international level, I guess, how you classify these technologies. So what mechanisms at an international level can we, if we need to change a classification, how would we do that in a relatively short time frame? Thoughts on that?
So the classification is, we expect that the core dimensions of the classification will not change. However, within specific criteria within each of these dimensions, and there are many, and actually, for more information, we have all kinds of, short, medium length, and very lengthy material, 2-pager to get you started if you're interested, that summarizes the whole thing. Within each of these criteria, there will be evolutions, and so we will need to, we assume we will need to update this every 2 years. It doesn't get into that much detail that we think it would warrant more than updates every 2 years.
But you have a mechanism, you have a process for doing that.
Yes.
Yeah.
If I may add to that, David, I think maybe not to be too detailed in the legal technicalities, but the level of, let's say, techno neutrality, or the level of detailing, or the level of the security varies across various fields of the law. So if you talk about market admission, that's one other field than when you talk about, let's say, law enforcement or criminal investigations, etc. So in that way, I would say there is more to it than just one description for all fields of the law, and as a result of which, also different requirements for the, let's say, the updating mechanisms.
Yeah, no, I get that. Right, thank you. Now there's another question here, which takes us back to the definition question. This is really in the EU AI Act, but how do we draw the line between any software and the software that's in the scope of the regulation? So in other words, is there a simple way of saying, okay, what's in scope and what's not in scope in the context of the EU AI Act? This does take us back to the definition of AI, I guess.
Yes, if I may say, it gets back to the definition of AI in the AI Act, but again, there's an agile mechanism because it's in an appendix. So the technology that is used is really defined in the appendix. It's, as Karine said, it's about learning mechanism, but also about symbolic AI. Actually, everything is potentially there, but we don't want to overreach. There are some, for example, techniques such as probabilistic reasoning. This is something which is widely used. It's not specific to AI. So any system using probabilistic reasoning is not AI, of course. And this is clear, actually. And I think in the final versions, this will be clarified. And again, this has to be always updated and modified. But something else I wanted to say. Let's not get stuck in the definition aspects. What we need actually is what to do if there is a problem caused by a system. As in any other domain, we need auditing mechanisms to identify unwanted consequences and, for example, unfair bias. And we need to also develop redress mechanisms to deal with severe risks in AI sectors, in AI intensive sectors. This is even more important than the definition because it gives us a way to react when there are issues related to those systems. And this is true in other industry sectors as well.
Great, thank you, Rajat. Now, we've only got a few minutes left. I just want to get a quick forward-looking view from each of the panelists. And really, this is just a simple question around, maybe not a simple answer, but how much progress we'll see towards international harmonization in, let's say, a 5-year time frame. And I'm just going to give you 3 categories. So we're let's say, limited progress, stroke no progress, medium progress, or substantial progress. So in other words, really, how optimistic are you that this international consensus will emerge? Maybe I'll start with Karine on that, because you probably live and breathe some of this. If you, on those 3 categories, limited, medium, or substantial, where would you sit in a 5-year time frame?
A couple months ago, I would have said substantial, and now I would say medium to substantial.
Okay. Well, so quickly, what's changed your view in the last couple of months?
I just think things have gotten, discussions in some areas have gotten a little more complicated, but I'm still very, very, very optimistic.
Okay, you're sensing some momentum there by the sounds of it. Everett, maybe come to you next.
Yeah, I would choose. I was about to say medium, but now I hear Karine. I would say it's limited but substantial in terms of limited to the northwestern regions of the world as we find it. So let's say the producing and consuming fast forward moving economies will probably find enough incentives to reach some consensus here, but it will not, but it will be limited in that way.
So geographically limited,
yeah.
Within that geography.
That is what I expect. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And Raja, final word from you.
Yes, I agree with that. It's on the positive side, medium plus, I would say. But we need to also know that it depends on the international context and the geopolitical context. Things are getting tense today, and this might lead to a better cooperation, or it might lead to less cooperation depending on the regions of the world. So we have to keep in mind that AI is not just there sitting on its own.
Yeah.
There's a global context.
It doesn't exist in a vacuum, obviously. Yeah, quite. Okay, well, thank you to the panel for your insights. And I know we had to move quite quickly there, but I think you've given us some really good, views on what's happening and how much progress we're making. So thank you for that. And thank you as well to the audience for joining us today. As I mentioned, I'll produce a write-up of this workshop, which will be published by Science Business, capturing some of the highlights. So look out for that. And Science Business will also make a recording of the webinar available, so you can watch back any segments that you want to recap on. Yeah, thanks again for your engagement and your questions, and we will conclude there. Thank you all.